In the 1984 film Amadeus, Antonio Salieri tells his life story to a priest. As a youth, Salieri prayed to God for musical talent. In return, he gave God his chastity and his eternal gratitude. Many years later, now as a court composer, he meets Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, a young man considered far more talented than himself, but not bearing any of Salieri's faithfulness or piety. Salieri grows envious of Mozart and angry with God. Why would God bless Mozart, who behaves boorishly, with greater talent? Salieri eventually rebels against both God and Mozart, planning to make a mockery of both of them. In disguise, Salieri commissions Mozart to compose a requiem. Salieri plots to kill Mozart once the piece is finished, then premiere it at Mozart's own funeral, claiming the work as his own. In doing this, he will use Mozart's blessing of musical talent as his own to rise above Mozart and humiliate God himself. This plan largely fails. Mozart dies before the requiem is even completed, and Salieri spends the rest of his days in obscurity. Amadeus is a great movie, and it also presents a great opportunity to ask this question: how much control does God have in our lives? Now, for non-theists, this can be answered by rejecting the premise of the question that God first exists. But for theists, this is a significant question and one that comes up a lot in our example, Amadeus. The question relates to metaphysical freedom. Metaphysical freedom is related to last week's episode, the concept that free will requires alternate possibilities. In order to freely choose to do some action X, it must be possible to not do action X. If there is only one action you can take, then you cannot act freely. You would have no choice. This is sometimes called libertarian intuition, completely unrelated to political libertarianism. Rather than looking at this from the standpoint of hard determinism related to the observable sciences, Amadeus brushes up against freedom from a metaphysical and theological perspective. Salieri faithfully believes in God, specifically the Christian God. When he was young, he prayed to God for the talent to create music and the opportunity to advance in that career. He claimed that he wanted to use music to praise the name of God. Salieri's Christian faith posits that God is all-knowing, omniscient. God knows everything that ever was and ever will be. That means if God knows everything, God knows the future. A concept called omnitemporalism. The future is known to God. If it were not, then God would not know everything and would not meet most criteria of what people, particularly Christians, believe God to be. Salieri, like a good Christian, believes that God has some influence in his life, but he also probably believes in his own free will, a gift from God. Many Christians and other theists believe in their own free will because it explains their ungodly actions and because it solves, at least for them, the moral problem of evil. It's not God who is bad, it's just that humans are bad, and God gives them options through free will. Salieri believes Mozart is vulgar and immoral. He condemns Mozart for his human failings, at least at first. Free will seems to be required for moral responsibility. If we were given no other option but action X, and action X is immoral, are we at fault? If Christians believed God did not give them free will, how would they label anything a sin? If human beings had no free will, wouldn't all of humankind's sins be the sins of God instead? How could God punish someone for their sins if not performing the sin was impossible? What reward could one receive for doing good when not doing good was impossible? Free will is not only believed by theists to be a gift from God, but also necessary to believe in any kind of moral responsibility, which itself is a tenet of their faith. However, this line of thinking runs into a serious problem when confronted with omnitemporalism. If God knows everything that will happen, then our choices are already made. Bear in mind that this is not the same as saying predestination is incompatible with free will. Foreknowledge, not predestination. So how does any of that work? Well, let's say Salieri needs to decide between being a friend to Mozart or being his enemy. Suppose then that God, who knows the future, already knew that Salieri was going to see Mozart as his enemy and plot against him. God is all-knowing and he knows the future. So, with that in mind, is it possible for Salieri to do other than what God knew he was going to do? If the answer is no, then Salieri does not have an option and is therefore not free. If the answer is yes, then God is not all-knowing and is easily outsmarted by a human being. Therefore, he is not God. Only one option ever exists. The one God believes will happen. We see this in the film when Salieri tries to outmaneuver God through his ploy to have Mozart's divinely inspired music claimed for himself. It does not work because God is God and cannot be outmaneuvered. Towards the end of Amadeus, having finished his confession to the priest, Salieri asks how a merciful God could destroy Mozart, someone Salieri believed to be simply beloved by God, while keeping a mediocrity like Salieri from both sharing in that glory and remaining alive to live in obscurity. As he is pushed down the hall in a wheelchair, Salieri declares himself the patron saint of mediocrities and absolves the other patients of their inadequacies. Salieri believes everything that happens to him must be by God's design, and if he outlived Mozart, that too must have been God's will. By this logic, Salieri has no free will. Everything that Salieri tried to do to avoid his fate was also foreseen by God. If God is omniscient, then we run into omnitemporalism. And if someone knows the future, then our actions are definitely going to happen a certain way, and if they are, then we have no choice. Salieri was always going to do everything he did, and his attempts to subvert this were also part of his path to ending up where he did. There are a number of common solutions to the problem of foreknowledge and freedom compatibility, but they generally fall short. For example, some suggest that freedom and foreknowledge are compatible because, by having foreknowledge, God is not actively using his power to completely force you to make a certain decision. However, the problem of foreknowledge and freedom compatibility is not a problem of action, but a problem of consequences. The suggestion that God has foreknowledge logically entails that you do not have alternate possibilities. Remember something besides X? And if you don't have alternate possibilities, you are not free. In Amadeus, we see Salieri pray to God many times, asking for guidance and for clarity on why Mozart was chosen to be more talented and to be the vessel of God's music. Those who are skeptical of the existence of God sometimes ask, what is the point of prayer? If God knows everything you're going to do, it is already fixed. Okay, that has a certain kind of logic, but really, if God already knows everything you're going to do, you could say that about any activity, not just prayer. Another attempt to counter the problem of foreknowledge is called the backtracking counterfactual objection. It suggests that even if God does have foreknowledge, it is still within your power to act otherwise, because if you were to act otherwise, then God would just have had a different belief about the future than he did. In other words, if Salieri were to act differently, God would have believed differently than he had. Unfortunately, this still runs into the problem that God can't have believed differently than he did. The fact that God believed as he did is already a fact, already written into the past. God believing differently than he did is no longer possible, which means Salieri acting otherwise to what God believed about the future is no longer possible. Backtracking counterexamples do not solve the problem. God can know what the future holds only if he already exists, which means our future is already set. God's complete foreknowledge is incompatible with free will because it entails a temporal ontology. So, does God control our lives? To theists who really think about it, maybe complete control simply due to foreknowledge. Maybe simply by virtue of existing. To Salieri, it's unclear. He seems to believe in some kind of middle ground in which God blesses certain people but somehow exists atemporally and does not know the future or Salieri's clever scheme. Throughout the film, Salieri never needs to be convinced of the existence of God, even when he comes to believe that God rewards someone of supposedly bad moral standing like Mozart and ignores someone of supposedly good moral standing like himself. He never questions the existence of God, only his alleged omnibenevolence. What he really should have thought about was God's omniscience. It might have saved himself a lot of trouble. Hi everyone, if you like what I do, please click on the orange Patreon link below. That's how this show happens. It's also the only way to request an episode. Also, please like, share, subscribe, and click on the notification bell so that you never miss an episode. I'll see you next week.